Everybody. My name is Catherine Riley. I'm the Director of Science for the ALCF. But what I want to talk to you about today is actually the allocation programs for the facility, sort of how you get access to any of the systems, and I'll sort of highlight which ones and how as I go through. But feel free to ask questions. I have the chat window open. I will try to respond as they come through, but also just feel free to interrupt. I like questions. It's a more interesting talk that way. So one, I think, relevant piece of information so people understand is that the ALCF is a national user facility. That has a meaning, and the meaning is that we are focused on early science, and you'll see this reflected in our primary flagship program. And what our goal is with our allocation programs is to deliver computing and data capabilities that are significantly more powerful than other systems that typically are in use for scientific research. What I'm talking about today is the Theta resource and Polaris a little bit. And I'll give you sort of a quick insight into Polaris, although I'm not going to spend a lot of time on hardware details. All the hardware details on these systems are online, and they're in these slides as well. I'm just not going to spend too much time on them. But I'll also touch a little bit about Aurora and how that folds in and how people might be able to ask for time there. So Theta, as you know, is our current system on the floor, which includes the Theta GPU expansion recently. And this system is entirely allocated through our allocation programs. I think as I said, the most relevant part, I think, today's conversation is the Theta GPU expansion. But also its connection to Grand and Eagle, which are our new file systems focused on file sharing. So actually collaborative file sharing for communities. Polaris is the new system coming on the floor. It is on the floor today, but still getting plugged in and tested and spun up. And I think the key component to Polaris is what I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, which is a readiness platform for Aurora. But so you have a sense of what this is. This is a 560 node system with a 1:4 CPU to GPU ratio. So NVIDIA A100s are making up the bulk of this system. There's a lot of details, as I said. I don't want to turn this into a hardware talk. So it's not to undercut it at all. And this is also here for reference, which just sort of gives you a sense of the software system that people will see on Polaris by default. But the exciting part from our mind, really, that for Polaris is that it's going to be an incredibly powerful environment to test exascale programming models. That's one of the primary, cool deliverables in the system, is that our goal is to have all of the real programming models people are exploring on the same system. And allow people to explore. So for Polaris, as I sort of said, we'll have sort of this long list of the programming models and helping people get ready for Aurora. But there's a lot of other aspects, including the system software, even learning frameworks that are also going to give people a really powerful ability to test their applications as we're moving into Aurora in the 2022 installation timeframe. So as I mentioned, Aurora, this is going to be our exascale system being delivered in 2022. There's not a lot that we can say because of NDA reasons, but I think a couple things that are worth noting is that it will be 2 Intel Xeon CPUs with 6 Intel Ponte Vecchio GPUs per node, and we'll have the Deos file system, which is actually also a really fantastic innovation for applications and scientific research. This is just another view on that. But also sort of another component to this is that, the relatively newer information and level of NDA things that we can say is that it will be a minimum of 9,000 nodes. But the time frame for this is relevant as we're talking about the allocation programs that we use for the facility. And in particular, for example, in 2022, we are allocating explicitly, even right now, through some of our programs, Theta and Polaris. And Aurora is primarily only allocatable now through the Insight program, since it's sort of in an out year allocation. So how do you gain access to these programs, and what are these programs that are being applied to these systems? So the bulk of our time, 60% of the time on these resources, goes to our flagship program, Insight. And this is jointly run by the ALCF and the OLCF. So the two leadership computing facilities jointly run this flagship program. 20% of the systems go to Oscar's Leadership Computing Challenge. So this is run by the Department of Energy, our sponsors. And while we have a little bit of collaboration with them about this, this is entirely their program. And I'll give you more details about that. And then another 20% is for the facility itself, for the ALCF to manage our director's discretionary pool. And so out of that 20% includes things like targeted programs like our data science program and our early science programs, also proposal preparation for Insight or ALCC. Also our support of exascale computing program comes out of there, amongst other things. This is the high level view of all three programs to give you, like if you just needed one quick reference slide for the three ways that the facilities are allocated, this would be it. The key thing is that Insight is focused on open science, and it is focused on a smaller number of projects getting a very large fraction of the resource in order to do really high impact work, perhaps high impact and very high risk work. For ALCC, the one that the DOE runs, they tend to be relatively large, although there's a lot more dynamic range in the size of the allocations coming through that program. And then for the discretionary, it is a huge dynamic range, because it's everybody getting from token size things just to see if they are ready to use a large scale system, all the way to people who are asking for support to do a campaign after they're finishing an Insight award or something akin to that. So it's a huge range. But one of the other key components of the differences that's useful to see in this chart is the readiness of applications going into these programs. And what readiness means here is how capable are you at using large scale systems, right? So how ready are you to exploit the hardware on Polaris or on Aurora, for example, in out years? And for Insight, we have a very high readiness criteria. So while the science might be high risk, we're looking for people who really know what they're doing and are really capable of working with the machine. ALCC has a medium to high risk, right? So they don't require as much level of readiness and are willing to accept a little bit more risk that a project might not be able to get going. And for the discretionary projects, it's quite variable. If you're asking for a tiny amount to see if you're ready to use a large scale supercomputer, we don't have a high readiness requirement, right? But if you're asking for some very large amount of time to do something, our readiness requirement starts escalating, right? It's really a function of how much time people are asking for. But fundamentally, all three of these programs are open to all scientific researchers and all organizations, and are really looking for those projects that need leadership level computing to move forward. A new thing that I'll touch on later is with Insight, which is a new component to the program, which is sort of a landing place for those early in their career. So in the first 10 years of doing research, we have a new track this year where we're trying to encourage more researchers within those 10 years to apply and feel like they have a chance to be competitive. So I'm going to start first and actually talk about the discretionary program and what sort of folds into that and what those programs look like within the discretionary, and then work our way up and spend the last few minutes talking about Insight, because we'll talk more about what Insight looks like.
Hey, Catherine, can I have a question? Can you go back to 2 slides back? Okay, yeah. This table. Okay, so total hours. So what is this numbers telling me?
Oh yeah, and I will I'll unwind that a little bit later, but okay, there's a certain amount of time, right? Just literal, like given the number of nodes on a system, and given that we're allocating for a year, and say for Insight that we're allocating 60%, there's a certain amount of time that's available, a certain pool of time that is available.
2 months, Polaris node hours. That's how I read.
2 million. I'm sorry. So
2 million hours.
2 million node hours. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
And I will say that these are not normalized node hours, right? So Polaris is a pretty powerful machine at around 44 petaflops, but with 560 nodes. So those are very powerful nodes, which is why the numbers look so variable. That number is also, I would expect for the future, if you're thinking about Polaris, that number is likely to grow for what will be in the Insight pool. It's just what is, what we currently have on the floor is potentially available for 2022.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Lane, is your hand up?
Yes, quick question related to director discretionary. For a researcher that's used former ALCF resources but doesn't have a current project, started their own research group, if we would want, let's say we burn through one director's discretionary allocation of like 100K within 3 months, could we request a second one in the same year of, let's say we need another 50 before we're ready to submit a larger ALCC?
Absolutely. And you asked it perfectly, because it kind of transitions to some of the things I say in here that are less on the slide. Absolutely. So the discretionary are meant to be rolling and are given in small amounts, especially for projects that are getting going, just to make sure that they get going, right? You may absolutely request, within the same project, a new award of time. You just can go through the same process, demonstrate progress, that you made with the previous award, or explain what happened with the previous amount of time, and request some new time. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. And so I think that, given those two questions, right, I think this kind of maps very quickly into what I was going to say here. The default discretionary award is meant to be like that first step, getting going kind of project. And it could be really first steps, like you're just getting used to a large scale resource for some people, versus your first steps to preparing for a proposal. We do tend to give those for these shorter windows, like sometimes 3 months or 6 months, and we're not trying to be onerous about it. It's mostly to encourage, discretionary projects to come back to us, interact with us a little bit, let us know, where they're having successes or failures, right? And to not sort of completely over allocate the resource. It's another way of us sort of actually just keeping responsible bookkeeping, honestly. But that's one of the reasons why they tend to be short, but they're completely renewable. You don't have to go through sort of the full, create a new project thing. It would just be awarding more time to that same project. Within that 20%, we also support various other strategic programs for the facility. One of them is our data science program. This is a relatively small program, and in the sense that we don't, choose many projects through this program. It might be 1 or 2 per year. But the reason this program was created was to target big data-driven problems and work with them collaboratively to get their technologies ready to be an Insight or ALCC program, a project, especially since we hadn't seen, when we started this program several years ago now, right? There weren't as many of projects that were really data-driven, big data-driven within the big allocation programs. And so we really wanted a collaborative experience with some teams who were interested in that, so that one, we could learn and improve the facility by collaborating with them, but then also get them ready and get them competitive for Insight and ALCC. So we do have this call annually. This is fundamentally a program that is built around the model that we have, how we work anyway, which is collaboratively, right, to develop programs to make sure that they are ready to compete. But it was to call this out, to make sure, again, I think that an idea of a landing place for folks is valuable. And so this gave people with big data driven problems or learning driven problems a place where they felt they could land, and they actually, we were willing and wanted to very much support this type of project, and we do. The early science program is another one of these projects that we support through the DED program. And this is a weird one to bring up, because it's not like there's a regular call, but you hear about this, and I want to inform people about what it is. So when we deploy a new system, we have an early science program, so that it's sort of a collaborative process, just like I was mentioning with the data science program, but where we are able to get to work with scientists to get their science and applications as close to ready as possible for new systems when they're plugged in. So we've got science ready to go on day one. So the teams themselves within this program have that competitive advantage of being ready early, But what we get out of that is some of the best testing we can for new software stacks that are going onto systems and new hardware. And I will tell you, there's very few things we have found, that can break, especially software stacks, as effectively as large scale scientific applications. So this is a very symbiotic relationship with the researchers that enter the early science program and the facility, to make sure that the facility is deploying systems as good as possible for science. The program for Aurora is well underway, but I would encourage you, if this is something that sounds kind of interesting to you, they tend to be longer lived projects over several years. Keep your eye open, right? We will be deploying a system for Aurora, so there will be another early science program. But we will be seeing more and more of these particular projects over the course of the next year and a half as Aurora becomes a reality. All right. So moving into sort of the major awards, the major two award programs, as I mentioned, which are Insight and ALCC. I'm going to talk first about ALCC because really we can say less about ALCC than we can about Insight, not for any NDA reasons, just because of the way that they're managed. So the primary one is that the ALCC program is run by our program sponsors in the Department of Energy, by the Oscar office. And its mission is to support DOE priorities. Now, that does not mean you need to have DOE funding, nor does it mean that you have to be part of sort of the DOE ecosystem of researchers. It means it has to align with DOE priorities, which often, for example, align with the current priorities in research for the federal government. They do this call once a year. So you can be looking in the next few weeks. By early November, they expect the call for 2022, sorry, I'm losing track of my years these days. The call will be open this November to award for 2022 and 2023, because the award year is from July. That's when the allocations begin through midway through the next year. Most of the time, and you should be prepared for this if you're interested in ALCC, is that the first time the call, the first part of the call is to submit letters of intent. You could expect those to be due, say, before the Christmas holidays. And so then after the letters of intent, ALCC and Oscar, they go through those letters of intent to determine who should go forward to write a full proposal. The awards vary dramatically. This award size of 1 million note hours here is got huge deviation on it. It's very, very big range. And that's really rooted in theta numbers, because we don't really have average allocations yet to talk about of what they might be on Polaris. Although you could expect that in sort of native Polaris hours, they might be 200 or 300 million note hours. For some, substantially less. They do award only for a year, and they award 20% of the system, although they often don't do the full 20%. They might hold back some of that for strategic priorities. So to give you a sense of that, of what that means, COVID-19 research used a great deal of time, actually all of the DOE computing centers in the past year and a half. For the 2 leadership computing facilities, that time came out of ALCC. So the time sort of, that they would either take back from projects that weren't using their time or didn't allocate were there to support that sort of urgent computing need. But I will just repeat, this is a program that requires letters of intent if you want to apply against it. So, and you will expect that both Theta and Polaris will be available for the call that's opening this November. All right, Insight is the one that I'll talk a little bit more about. And in part because there's a lot more in the review process, but it's also the program that we jointly run with ALCF. So I will also say that I'm the program manager for Insight now. So this means that I'm sort of coordinating with myself and peers at ALCF, along with folks at ALCF, moving this program forward. The primary feature of Insight is that this is a project focused on really addressing grand challenges, really big problems, really high impact problems. The only eligibility requirement is that researchers are going to publish this research, so it has to be open science. While there are mechanisms within the facilities to support things that aren't open science, really this is sort of mission driven, right? We do a 2-part review process, and I will walk you through that in sort of short form to give you a sense. But I think the other relevant difference here for Insight is that we award 1, 2, or 3 year proposals. if you are awarded a 2 or 3 year proposals, then every year you go back for a renewal. It's not automatic, although the renewal rate is very high, and we try to make it very clear what a PI needs to demonstrate in order to have a successful renewal. But we do have projects that we absolutely commit to for sort of long term in order to make sure that their science is accomplished. In terms of time frame for Insight, the call will open in April. It closes at the end of June every year, and then that starts the review process. And so for example, for the review process going on right now, we're making decisions this month, and we'll be making announcements for Insight 2022 at the beginning of November. All right. So as I mentioned, there is, the eligibility is very broad for Insight. The primary merit criteria, right, is that you have work that has potential for significant impact or community impact. Impact is broadly defined. It does not need to be like you've just answered question X. Sometimes impact is you're generating a data set that everybody needs, or something, something else, but impact in the community. The other primary thing is that it's work that really can't be done reasonably on any other resource. And there's different reasons for that. Sometimes it's because you have hardware or some sort of specific architectural need for the leadership computing facility, but it could also be that your time to solution, right? Yeah, maybe you could do this on different resources, but it would take a year to get the answer. And there's reasons that, being able to do this in a week are really significant. So it's a broad range of what might mean needing leadership computation, but that is a requirement. And beyond that, as I mentioned, there's no source of funding requirement. Anyone can apply with any source of funding, and non-US based researchers are absolutely welcome to apply. All right. So to give you a sense of what Insight is looking for beyond just repeating this high impact science thing, when we have a new proposal, the most important part of the review process, the absolute most important part, is the peer review. So we have panels of experts that come together in particular areas of research to review proposals in that area. And we ask them to look for the science merit of the research or the technical merit of the research going on. And we also ask them to make sure, they approach the appropriateness of the methods that are being proposed, the milestones that were given, right? Is this a reasonable way to be tackling this problem given their knowledge? But also asking, is this the right team to be doing this? And is this the right amount of time for not only the method that they're using, but for, say, the potential impact of the problem? There's also a computational readiness review. And so this is executed by the Leadership Computing Facility. So it's executed both by the ALCF and the OLCF, where we're just looking for technical readiness. It's sort of this way of assessing, are the researchers in this proposal, are they ready to go on day one? Or will it take them 6 months to be ready to execute their problem? Have they already been running on the facility and so know what's going on? And is the amount of resource that they're asking for appropriate? Like, did they actually go through the process of benchmarking their problem and calculating out their total amount of time in a reasonable way? And so to give in contrast, as I mentioned, right, Insight is a 1, 2, or 3 year proposal. The renewal assessment is very different. We are not redoing the science merit and review. We're really looking to make sure that you've stayed on track, that you haven't changed scope. I mean, proposals absolutely change, right? Because as you're going forward, things happen, but that there hasn't been a substantial change in scope, and that you're meeting your milestones, or if milestones are diverging or sort of changing course, that is understood why and what's driving that. And it's very similar on the computational readiness review on renewals, right? If there were technical or computational milestones, just are they on track? Are they meeting those? And the final decision process for Insight is really made by bringing these two things together. It's made by the awards committee, which is the Leadership Computing Facilities directors, the program manager, and the directors of science. And we sort of take primarily this peer review input and the computational readiness information and fold that together, using the computational readiness really as more of a risk assessment on the projects than a real make it or break it. Okay. So then a couple other things about trends and insight, I think relevant to the topic of this workshop is we have seen a substantial growth in the number of projects in Insight that are using data or learning techniques that have large data components, right? That, you know, have very interesting workflows for incorporating those. This is absolutely valued and supported in the Insight program. And I can't say that strongly enough, right? We're looking for impactful ways of getting science done, right? And if it's the right approach, or if it's a good approach, that's fine. But part of the ways that we have folded this in is some domains are still becoming, I would say, more fluent in learning and data techniques than other communities where you have more representation of these approaches. So while we try to bring in a panel of the right types of experts, right, once we see the proposals and we look at who we need on those panels, we will be trying to say, bring in someone who's got a lot of data and learning experience in that specific domain. That's not always possible. So we also have a specific learning panel. And so this year, for example, that panel looked at several proposals that were focused entirely on actually data and learning techniques that were uniquely in that panel. But then also they do kind of what I would say like a sanity check, almost a computational readiness review on the other proposals that have large learning components, even though they're primarily a domain specific proposal, just to determine if those methods are appropriate and will meet the rigor of the science that they are trying to tackle. All right. And these are just some numbers to give you a sense between the two leadership computing facilities, what Insight looks like right now in terms of the total number of projects and the average project sizes. This will look very different for 2022. As there will be 4 systems across this, will be much more crowded chart, and then a 5th system in 2023. But I think the key thing to take away from this is right now, say on Theta, the total number of projects is relatively small, and actually the reason for that is because we have a relatively small resource. There's a 300 petaflop machine that was never installed at the ALCF. So Theta is small for today's standards. And so actually to really deliver on our mission of delivering more computational resources than one might be able to get really anywhere else to do certain problems, we actually allocate a much smaller number of projects. You will, as I said, expect that for the ALCF, you'll see Polaris in 2022 and in future years. And I think really the other component to this is that the projects are relatively large, right? So we're talking, you know, at 14 projects, 16 projects last year, you know, 1.2 million node hours on Theta. I think for Polaris, the average award is likely to be in the 200 to 500 million node hours, Polaris node hours, so pretty large. I had mentioned earlier that Insight introduced in the 2022 call, so the one that is coming into close soon, an early career track. And the idea behind this was that we wanted to encourage the next generation of researchers to engage in the program and feel like they had a landing place. We had heard from many people, some of them, even, through formal mechanisms, some casually and sort of, through back channels, that it was very hard for some people to convince themselves to apply when they knew, for example, that their advisor and their advisor's advisor were applying. And so to compete against, say, some of the names in their field seemed daunting and not viable. So we wanted to make sure that young researchers had a place to land and knew that there was actually an opportunity, that there was a track where they could get actually some degree of competitive advantage. And so we launched the early career track. And so this is focused on researchers within their first 10 years of earning their PhD. We are reserving up to 10% of the total Insight time for those in their early career. It could be more. And I will tell you, there are many really good early career proposals that came through, many that are completely meritorious, that need no extra competitive boost. But I share that to say, this isn't like a bringing proposals up from the bottom. Folks are very good and very competitive here, but but I really wanted to make sure that they had a landing place. They went through the same review process, and actually, you know, the peer panel did a great job of sort of trying to remove thinking about whether this person was early career or not, just in terms of assessing actually the merit of a proposal. All right, and this is it. I leave with this slide, as I think it's, you know, it's the reference slide for most people for the summary of the allocation programs, to maybe determine where you might fit and where you might pursue further information.